What if the deepest crisis shaking the church today is not first about structures, leadership, or external pressure, but something far more hidden and personal, something taking place in the heart of every believer? When we look at the confusion, the decline in faith, and the weakening of moral conviction, it becomes easy to list symptoms, but much harder to identify the root cause that quietly feeds all of them. There is a strong argument that beneath everything happening right now, there is one driving force that continues to shape the entire crisis. It is not the only factor, and it would be too simplistic to reduce everything to a single explanation, but it may be the most foundational. Until this element is restored, many of the problems we see will continue to repeat in different forms. That central issue is the collapse of sacrifice within the life of the church. The word itself is often used, but rarely understood in its full depth. People hear sacrifice and think of giving something up in a general sense, but the traditional and theological meaning goes much deeper than personal effort or temporary loss. To understand what is really being lost, we have to return to the classical definition of sacrifice. In dogmatic theology, sacrifice is described as the offering and real or symbolic destruction of something material, carried out by a legitimate minister and directed toward God. Its purpose is to recognize God's supreme authority and to repair the disorder caused by human sin. Within this definition, there are essential components that cannot be separated without losing the meaning itself. Sacrifice is not just giving something away, and it is not just symbolic action. It is a structured act that involves offering separation, transformation, and completion directed entirely toward God. One of the first and most important elements is the act of offering. This is where something is set apart specifically for God, no longer belonging to ordinary use. In theological language, what is offered is removed from common purpose and dedicated entirely to divine worship, forming what ancient texts call the things that are offered. This act of setting apart is not minor. It defines whether something is truly a sacrifice or not. Once something is offered to God in this way, it is no longer meant to return to ordinary use. Even in ancient understanding of liturgy, once the offering was made, it belonged to God in such a way that it could not simply be taken back or redirected. From this flow, two deeper movements. First is interior detachment. The one offering must be willing to let go completely, not only externally, but within the heart. It is not enough to give something physically if internally one still clings to it. True offering requires a separation from attachment itself. This is where sacrifice becomes challenging, because it confronts human instinct to hold on, to control, and to retain what we value. Interior detachment means willingly loosening the grip on something we consider good, trusting that its offering to God produces a greater good than keeping it for ourselves. The second movement is external separation. What is offered must actually be released, not symbolically, but truly handed over. In the ancient sense, this was expressed by physically setting the offering apart so it no longer belonged to the one who gave it. This distinction becomes clearer when we look at the contrast between Cain and Abel. Abel offered the best of what he had, while Cain held back what was less valuable. The difference was not simply in the material gift, but in the interior disposition behind it, the willingness to give God the highest good rather than what is convenient or left over. This reveals something essential about sacrifice. God does not merely look at the act itself, but at what it costs the person offering it. The heart of sacrifice is not quantity, but priority. What is given to God reveals what is truly valued. At the core of every true sacrifice is this question: is the offering complete, or is something being held back? If anything is retained out of attachment or hesitation, the sacrifice is no longer fully what it is meant to be. It becomes incomplete and therefore weakened in its meaning. This is also why sacrifice always involves a form of death, whether literal or symbolic. Something must be surrendered in a way that it no longer remains under one's control. In spiritual terms, this points toward the dying of self-will in order for something higher to take its place. Without this element of surrender, sacrifice loses its transformative power. It becomes reduced to an external gesture rather than an interior act of worship. And when sacrifice is reduced in this way, its ability to connect the human person to God is also diminished. To understand why this matters so deeply for the present crisis, we must next look at how sacrifice reaches its fulfillment and how its meaning is revealed most perfectly in Christ and in the structure of the Mass itself. To understand sacrifice more deeply, we have to move beyond the idea of simple offering and enter into its final stages, where meaning becomes complete. In classical theology, sacrifice is not only about giving something up, but about what ultimately happens to what is offered. The process is only finished when it reaches its final purpose. After the offering and detachment comes the moment of consummation, where the gift is fully given over to God without reservation. This is not just a symbolic ending, but the completion of the entire act. What was set apart and surrendered is now brought to its final state, where nothing remains that belongs to the one who offered it. Between offering and consummation lies another essential element, the destruction or immolation of the victim. In ancient sacrificial language, this often meant the literal death of what was offered. The purpose of this act was not violence for its own sake, but total transformation of ownership from human control to divine belonging. This idea of death is central because it expresses finality. Once something is sacrificed, it cannot be reclaimed or reused for its original purpose. It passes beyond the sphere of ordinary life and enters a new relation with God. This is what gives sacrifice its seriousness and weight. In the Old Testament understanding, especially in the sacrificial system described in Leviticus, this destruction was often complete, such as in burnt offerings where the entire victim was consumed. Nothing was left behind for personal use. This signified total surrender to God without remainder. This structure is not accidental or symbolic in a loose sense. It reveals a deeper spiritual law, that communion with God requires the passing over of something valuable from human possession into divine possession. Without this transfer, sacrifice remains incomplete. This is why the order of sacrifice matters. The offering begins the movement, detachment enables it, destruction seals it, and consummation completes it. Each stage depends on the one before it, forming a single continuous act rather than separate steps. This structure becomes fully revealed in the sacrifice of Christ. In Christian theology, all true sacrifice finds its fulfillment in Him. Every earlier form points toward His perfect act, where offering, death, and consummation are united in one divine event. In Christ, the offering is expressed in His complete submission to the will of the Father. This is seen most clearly in the moment of His prayer in the garden and throughout His earthly life, where His human will is fully aligned with divine will. The offering is not partial, but total. The act of destruction or immolation is fulfilled in His passion and death. Here, sacrifice reaches its most visible and historical form. His suffering and death are not random events, but the completion of the sacrificial movement, where life is freely given over for the salvation of others. Finally, consummation is expressed in His declaration that it is finished. This moment is not merely the end of physical life, but the completion of the entire salvific act. Everything required for redemption has been accomplished, and nothing remains incomplete. This structure is not only theological, but becomes the foundation for understanding the Mass. The Mass is not a new sacrifice separate from Christ's, but the real and temporal participation in His one eternal sacrifice. It makes present what was accomplished once and for all. Within the Mass, the same sacrificial structure is visible. The offering is present in the presentation of the gifts, where material elements are set apart for divine use. This mirrors the ancient offertory, where something is removed from ordinary life and dedicated to God. The consecration corresponds to the sacrificial immolation. Here, through the words of Christ spoken by the priest, the bread and wine are transformed into His body and blood. The sacramental reality reflects a mystical separation, expressing the sacrificial death in a non-bloody but real way. The communion and reception correspond to consummation. In traditional theological understanding, the priest's reception of the Eucharist signifies the completion of the sacrificial act at the altar. The faithful also participate in this consummation through communion, but within a structured order of participation. This reveals something important. Sacrifice is not only something Christ performed once in history, but something the Church enters into continually. Every Mass is a participation in that same movement of offering, death, and fulfillment directed toward God. Because of this, sacrifice is not symbolic sentiment, but the very structure of worship. Without it, the Mass loses its identity and becomes something else entirely. It is precisely this sacrificial structure that connects heaven and earth in a living way. Understanding this also clarifies why sacrifice is not destruction for its own sake, but transformation toward a higher good. What is given up is not lost, but fulfilled in a greater form. This is the logic that runs through all authentic sacrifice. The logic of sacrifice does not remain confined to theology or liturgy. It extends into the structure of human life itself. What happens at the altar is meant to reflect what should be happening in the soul, because sacrifice is not only a ritual act, but a pattern of existence ordered toward God. This becomes clearer when we look at how participation in the Mass involves the faithful. The offertory is not only the priest's action, but also the spiritual offering of the people. The faithful unite their prayers, sufferings, and daily struggles with the sacrifice being offered at the altar. In this sense, the Mass becomes a shared movement. The priest offers the sacrificial act in an objective and sacramental way, while the faithful interiorly unite themselves to that offering. Their participation is not passive, but involves a real interior surrender of life to God. The idea of slaying of the victim takes on a spiritual meaning here. It refers not to physical death for the faithful, but to the interior willingness to die to self, especially to disordered desires, personal comfort, and resistance to God's will. This is where sacrifice becomes personal and demanding. It is no longer only about ritual structure, but about the daily decision to place God above preference, emotion, and convenience. Without this interior dimension, external participation in worship becomes shallow. The consummation for the faithful is expressed in Holy Communion. In receiving the Eucharist, the faithful are drawn into the completed sacrifice of Christ. Yet this completion is not automatic. It presupposes interior alignment with what is being received. This reveals a deeper truth. Participation in sacrifice always requires correspondence between external action and internal disposition. Without interior detachment, even sacred acts risk becoming routine rather than transformative. Outside the liturgy, sacrifice continues in daily life. Every Christian vocation carries its own structure of offering, self-denial, and fulfillment. This is especially visible in states of life such as marriage, military service, and religious commitment. Marriage itself follows a sacrificial pattern. The initial offering is found in the mutual consent and commitment of spouses. This is not merely an emotional decision, but a formal act of self-gift, where each person gives themselves to the other before God. The exchange of vows represents a deeper level of sacrifice, where personal autonomy is surrendered. Each spouse accepts a new state of life defined by responsibility, fidelity, and mutual obligation. This is a form of dying to individual self-determination. The consummation of marriage completes this sacrificial structure, not only in physical union, but in the lived reality of shared life. Marriage becomes a continuous sacrifice, where love is expressed through daily self-giving rather than isolated moments. In military service, a similar structure appears. The offering begins when a person commits themselves to service, accepting authority and discipline. This is a deliberate surrender of personal independence for a higher collective good. The slaying of the victim in this context is the willingness to face danger, hardship, and even death. The soldier no longer lives primarily for personal safety or comfort, but for the mission and the protection of others. The consummation is found in the full integration of this self-gift into the common good. Even if physical death does not occur, the identity of the soldier is shaped by this willingness to give everything for something greater than himself. What unites these examples is the same sacrificial pattern: offering, surrender, and fulfillment. Whether in liturgy or life, sacrifice always involves the movement from self-centeredness to self-gift directed toward a higher good. When this pattern is broken or distorted, confusion enters. If offering is replaced by self-protection or surrender is replaced by control, the structure of sacrifice collapses and loses its meaning. Life then becomes fragmented rather than ordered. This is where the deeper crisis begins to emerge. When sacrifice is no longer understood or practiced, both religious and natural structures begin to weaken. Worship loses depth, and human relationships lose stability. When we begin to look at the current crisis in the Church through the lens of sacrifice, a clearer pattern starts to emerge. What appears at first as a collection of unrelated problems, moral failures, liturgical confusion, weakened doctrine, and institutional instability begins to show a deeper common root. There is a long-standing tendency to treat each crisis as separate, as if each issue requires its own isolated solution. But beneath these visible problems, there is a more fundamental law shaping them all: the diminishing sense of sacrifice as the guiding principle of Christian life and ecclesial identity. At one point, there was a strong awareness that the Church is defined by offering, self-gift, and worship directed entirely toward God. Over time, however, attention has gradually shifted towards secondary concerns, and in many cases toward concerns that are purely worldly in nature. This shift is not always dramatic or intentional. It often happens gradually, through small adjustments in priorities. What begins as a desire to engage the modern world can slowly turn into an absorption by it, where the logic of the world begins to shape the logic of the Church. One of the clearest signs of this shift is when the greater good of salvation becomes less central than other considerations. When concern for souls is replaced or overshadowed by political, social, or institutional priorities, the sacrificial focus of the Church begins to weaken. This is especially visible when the Church is more concerned with external approval than with fidelity to its mission. The primary purpose of the Church is the salvation of souls. Yet this can become obscured when other goals are treated as equal or even more important. In such a context, sacrifice becomes unintelligible. If the ultimate goal is no longer clearly understood as union with God, then self-denial and offering lose their meaning. Without a transcendent purpose, sacrifice appears unnecessary or even harmful. This also affects moral life. When sacrifice is weakened, moral discipline is often reduced to personal preference or psychological comfort. Instead of being seen as a path toward holiness, moral demands are sometimes treated as optional or negotiable. As a result, behaviors that once would have been clearly recognized as contrary to Christian life are often met with silence or hesitation. This silence is not always the result of agreement, but often the result of a loss of clarity about what must be ultimately defended. The same pattern appears in preaching and catechesis. When sacrifice is no longer central, the tendency arises to avoid difficult teachings in order to maintain comfort or acceptance. But this avoidance comes at a cost, because truth without sacrifice loses its transformative force. A similar dynamic can be seen in the liturgical life of the Church. When the sacrificial nature of worship is no longer strongly emphasized, the liturgy risks being reduced to something closer to a communal gathering rather than an act of divine offering. In such cases, the sense of God as the ultimate recipient of worship becomes less prominent, and the focus can subtly shift toward human experience. Even when not intended, this shift alters the perceived meaning of what is taking place. But when the liturgy loses its sacrificial center, something essential is lost. Worship is no longer primarily understood as giving something to God, but as receiving something for ourselves. This reverses the traditional order of sacrifice. The consequences of this reversal extend beyond liturgy. When sacrifice is no longer understood as foundational, even moral discipline and ecclesial responsibility begin to weaken. The willingness to endure difficulty for the sake of truth diminishes. This helps explain why certain failures are not only personal but systemic. When the underlying logic of sacrifice is weakened, it becomes harder for individuals and institutions alike to consistently choose the greater good over the lesser good. We also see this in how discipline is sometimes handled. When correction is avoided in favor of comfort or reputation management, the result is not peace but disorder, because true peace requires ordered sacrifice, not avoidance of it. Even well-intentioned efforts to simplify or modernize aspects of church life can unintentionally contribute to this problem if they reduce the sense of sacred seriousness or diminish the sense of offering directed toward God. At the heart of all these developments is the same underlying issue: the gradual replacement of sacrificial thinking with a more comfort-centered approach to faith and practice. Once this shift occurs, many other problems follow naturally. This does not mean that every problem can be reduced simplistically to one cause, but it does suggest that sacrifice functions as a foundational principle. When it is weakened, multiple areas of church life begin to reflect that weakening. If the collapse of sacrifice lies at the root of so many problems in the church and in Christian life, then the path forward cannot begin with surface reforms alone. It must begin with the recovery of what sacrifice actually means in its deepest sense, the complete ordering of the human person toward God through offering, detachment, and total self-gift. Restoration does not first mean structural change. It begins within the soul. A renewed church can only emerge from renewed individuals who once again understand that faith is not simply affirmation or identity, but participation in a life shaped by sacrifice. At its core, sacrifice is about choosing the greater good over the lesser good consistently and concretely. It is the daily decision to place God above comfort, truth above convenience, and holiness above self-preservation. Without this interior orientation, external reform remains fragile. This is why the spiritual tradition consistently emphasizes detachment. Detachment is not rejection of goodness in creation, but freedom from possession of it. It is the ability to receive created goods without being enslaved by them so that God remains the ultimate end. When detachment is lived authentically, sacrifice becomes possible in every area of life. Work, relationships, suffering, and even success become places where the soul learns to offer rather than to grasp, to give rather than to retain. This is also where true transformation begins. A person formed by sacrifice does not interpret life primarily through the lens of comfort or loss, but through the lens of meaning and divine order. Even difficulty becomes intelligible within a larger spiritual purpose. The saints consistently lived from this principle. Their strength was not rooted in external stability, but in interior surrender. Because they were detached from lesser goods, they were capable of receiving greater ones with freedom and peace. This same logic applies to the church as a whole. Renewal will not come primarily through institutional strategies alone, but through a rediscovery of sacrificial life among clergy and laity alike. Without this, reforms remain incomplete. When sacrifice is restored, vocation itself becomes clearer. The priesthood is understood again as self-offering, not self-fulfillment. Marriage is understood again as mutual sanctification through self-gift. Christian life becomes once again a lived participation in the cross. Even suffering, which is often avoided or resented, regains meaning when united to sacrifice. It is no longer meaningless pain, but becomes material that can be offered to God, transformed into grace, and united to Christ's own offering. This is why traditional spiritual teaching insists so strongly on offering up daily trials. Nothing is wasted when placed within the logic of sacrifice. Everything becomes capable of being transformed when it is freely given to God. The crisis, then, is not only about external problems, but about whether Christians still believe that giving something up for God actually leads to a greater good. Without that conviction, sacrifice collapses into loss rather than communion. But when that conviction is restored, everything changes. The soul begins to see that nothing truly given to God is lost. Instead, it is purified, elevated, and returned in a form that far exceeds what was surrendered. This is the paradox at the heart of sacrifice. What is surrendered is not destroyed, but fulfilled. What is given away is not lost, but transformed. What dies to self does not disappear, but is drawn into a higher life. This is why Christ's words remain central. The one who loses his life for his sake will find it. This is not metaphorical only. It expresses the fundamental structure of Christian existence shaped by sacrifice. The same principle applies to the church's renewal. A church that relearns how to sacrifice will also relearn how to worship, how to teach, how to govern, and how to heal. Everything flows from the same center. And so the answer to the crisis is not found in abandoning sacrifice, but in returning to it more deeply than before. Not as a burden, but as the path to true freedom. Not as loss, but as the only way to receive what is truly greater. When sacrifice is restored, worship becomes centered again on God. Moral life regains clarity, vocations become stronger, and the faithful rediscover that Christianity is not merely about affirmation, but about transformation through self-gift. In this light, even the words attributed to the angelic message at Fatima take on their full force: to make everything a sacrifice and offer it to God. Nothing is excluded from this invitation, because everything can be transformed when placed on the altar of divine love. Ultimately, the way out of the crisis is not complex in principle, even if it is demanding in practice. It is the return to a life where God is once again the highest good and where everything else is ordered beneath that reality. And in that return, sacrifice is no longer seen as a loss to be feared, but as the doorway through which everything is restored,